healthy is the absence of a diagnosis, the absence of things like hypertension or diabetes. Version 2 at one time was considered, well, doing preventive medical care, participating at the South Asian Heart Center, making sure that you were covering all the bases in reference to your blood pressure and clinical factors. But version 3 is a little different, and I'll define that in a moment. But before that, let me give you the goals, discuss the goals for our presentation. Today, we are going to define health. We're going to define what we mean by longevity and successful aging. We're going to try to understand the twin epidemics of diabetes and coronary artery disease, which are the basis of the founding and the maintenance of the South Asian Heart Center. And we'll go over the science behind the importance of regular routine and go over in detail as to why we have MEDS, which is our lifestyle methodology, which is what we provide to prevent cardiovascular disease, but more than and diabetes, but more than that, to enhance well-being. So as I mentioned, these are actually the typical conventional definitions of health is initially the absence of disease. But in the 1948 Constitution of the World Health Organization, health was defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease of infirmity. In other words, a state of contentment when there's just complete physical, mental, and social well-being and balance. Now, another way of defining health is the strength to be, the ability to pursue our life story without unsurmountable obstruction from illness. So for the particulars of this conversation, either one will work, but it's more than just not being sick. So why are we here? We're here because the South Asians have two epidemics of chronic disease. In this Indian subcontinent holds 60% of the global burden of coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease is a cause of heart attack and the most common cause of death in the industrialized world. So 3 out of 5 citizens in the Indian subcontinent have coronary artery disease. Also, the Indian subcontinent holds 50% of the global burden of diabetes mellitus. So area that only holds 17% of the world population carries a significant burden for both coronary artery disease and diabetes. Heart attacks in the South Asian population happen at a younger age, and when someone has a heart attack, they tend to have a 2 times the incidence of mortality as compared to same people of other ethnicities receiving the same medical care in the same hospital. So these are the statistics for diabetes. By 2030, India will hold almost 80 million individuals with diabetes. Now, why are we here? Well, we are here because most chronic diseases are preventable. So this is actually data from a study that was done in Germany, looking at 4 factors. These 4 factors are never smoking, having a BMI below 30, meaning not being obese, exercising or being physically active 3.5 hours per week, having a diet that is high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and low in meat consumption. So in Europe, only about 9% of the population actually live those 4 healthy habits, which is very similar to the US population. Now, when you look at the incidence of chronic disease, you can see that for diabetes, if you actually are never smoked, you have a BMI below 30, you're physically active, and you have a Mediterranean type diet, you can see a 93% drop in the incidence of diabetes, an 81% drop in the incidence of heart attack. Oops. a 50% drop in the incidence of stroke, and a 30% drop in the incidence of cancer. So you can see how important how we live, guides how we live without chronic disease. This is actually a study that was performed in people who were 70 to 90 years old. And this is a study again done in Europe. It's a health project. So they look at 70 and 90-year-old individuals and they follow them over a 10-year period, and they look at their mortality. What you can see up on the top line here is that individuals who actually had 4 of these healthy habits, meaning Mediterranean diet, only moderate alcohol consumption, non-smoking, and physical activity, after 10 years, 80% of them were still alive. However, when you look at individuals who have 0 to 1 healthy factors, there was a significant drop where there was a 60% 10-year mortality in those individuals. Now, so these are people who are elderly. I mean, they're over the age of 70. I'm over the age of 70. I don't consider myself elderly, but they consider them elderly. But anyhow, when you look at people over 70, if they had 4 of those factors, there was significant difference in longevity. Now, let's look at diabetes, because there's also this pandemic of diabetes. So this is actually a slide from the diabetes prevention study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. There were 2 studies that were published at that same time in 2002, 22 years ago. And one was in Finland, one in the USA. And they actually had 3 groups: people who were taking placebo, people who were taking metformin, and people who were on a lifestyle program, which included exercise, nutrition, and nutritional counseling. And the study was a 5-year study, but it had to be stopped early after 2.8 years, because they thought it was unethical not to tell the people on the placebo that exercising and following a good diet was associated with a 58% drop in the incidence of diabetes in people who were at the time considered to be pre-diabetic, as you can see over here. Metformin, which is a commonly prescribed drug, was associated with a 31% drop over 3 years in the incidence of diabetes, but 58% without metformin, just on lifestyle alone. Now, how do things, I'm so sorry, this is sort of behaving really funny. Now, let's take a look at how things interact, how clinical factors interact with lifestyle factors. So what are clinical factors? Well, things that you get in a blood test or at the doctor's office: your total cholesterol, your blood pressure, and your blood glucose. What are health behaviors? Not smoking, not being overweight, a BMI 25 or less. This is for non-South Asians. Being physically active and having a Mediterranean or vegetable-rich diet. So how do these clinical factors and ideal behaviors interact with each other? You can see that in this slide. You can see that if you had 3 ideal healthy factors, but you actually had none of the ideal clinical factors, there was still a significant drop in cardiac events. So this is no ideal health factors and no ideal clinical factors. You can see that there was a significant 2/3 drop in the incidence of cardiac events if you had the 3 ideal factors. So this is how things interact. Without any ideal risk factors and ideal health behaviors, you can see the lowest incidence of cardiovascular events. So this is actually very telling, that how we live interacts with the stuff that doctors measure in your office. And you can attenuate the things that doctors measure in the effect of things that doctors measure in their office by living well. Now, this is my only slide on smoking. And actually, smoking is really bad. And I don't think that we need to sort of tell anyone anything more about that. Now, what is successful living? Well, in order to have successful living, you need to be alive. You also need to be self-sufficient. Someone who depends on a nursing home or depends on someone else for their own needs, loses their personal freedom. They depend on someone else. And to be successfully alive, there has to be a certain element of contentment. So contentment here in this is defined and separated from happiness. For happiness to happen, you require a happening. You hear some good news, it makes you happy. But for contentment, to be present, nothing needs to happen. You're satisfied. And that's a very important part of successful living. You have had a satisfactory life and you're content. You're self-sufficient, and thank God you're alive. Now, let's talk a little bit about the genetics of longevity, because we always think, oh my God, it's all in the genes. But the genes only account for 25% of the longevity. So the genes of humankind have not changed much over the last 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, the average life expectancy was about 22 years of age. Today, the average life expectancy is 78. So without much genetic change, there has been a significant change in longevity. Longevity actually accounts for only that 25%. It's found in, or longevity genes are found in humans, yeast, flies, and worms. It is usually found in chromosome number 4. So most of the benefit on longevity is because of the development of aqueducts and sewers, refrigeration, and vaccination. If we were to eliminate all cancer, humans would only live about 4 more years. So it's not that doctors have, or science from the health point of view, has extended that longevity. It's just that public health and the successful government has been able to create aqueducts and sewers. Science have provided us with refrigeration and food safety, and we have developed vaccines and vaccination. Now, this is the data from which our MEDS platform came from. And this is from a paper that was published in 1980. And it actually reported the findings of a study that was done on Alameda County, where they actually look at 7 factors associated with successful aging in adults. So these are individuals over the age of 18. So there were 7,000 people, age 18 to age 74, who were entered in this study, and they were followed over 25 years. This is the report after the first 10 years. What was noted was that factors such as adequate sleep, sleeping 7 to 8 hours, regular vigorous physical activity like burning 210 calories per day on physical activity, maintaining a recommended weight, no smoking, none or moderate alcohol consumption. So moderate alcohol consumption was anything up to 5 beers per day, eating breakfast daily, and eating meals regularly and not snacking. So it was calculated that those 6 to 7 habits would add 7 years on average to a woman and 11.5 years on average to a man, even if they had medical problems at the beginning of the year of the study. So even if they had hypertension, or even if they had diabetes, or even if they had high cholesterol, those 7 factors added that increment in longevity. And that became a very classic study and is the basis for the MEDS platform at the South Asian Heart Center. Now, then the question is, if you actually are changing in midlife, how about if you incorporate those factors in midlife? And this was published in the American Journal of Medicine in 2007. And what they looked at was participants in what is known as the ARIC trial, which is a long-term prospective studies in Americans about, there are 15,708 participants in this study. And when they look at these 4 factors, eating 5 or more fruits or vegetable servings per day, regular physical activity, a BMI below obesity, and not smoking, it was noted that just from the European study, 8.5% of this population had those 4 healthy habits. So then they went to counsel those individuals who were not living those 4 healthy habits, and they were able to convert 8.4% or 970 subjects in the study. So what happened? People who were actually gone from not having those healthy habits to having those 4 healthy habits experience a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality over 4 years. That's more than I can do for you by taking a medication like a statin. And a 35% relative risk reduction of cardiovascular events over the next 4 years. So that's very impressive. So the take-home message is, yes, you can actually change midlife and gain some benefit, and that benefit is seen within those first 4 years of changing. So on that basis, then we created the MEDS platform. MEDS stands for meditation, E for exercise, D for diet, and S for sleep. And this is our proven methodology. Now, today, I'm just going to go over the data, the science behind our recommendations. So we're going to start with the M, or for meditation. So let's just first define stress. Stress means many things for many people. In this respect, I am showing you an example of psychosocial stress. Psychosocial stress arises when an individual is challenged and does not have the know-how or the capacity to deal with the challenge. The challenge here is the clock. Not enough time to do what is pending, to do what you are to do. That is, first of all, you have no self-control and you have too much to do and not enough time. That is psychosocial stress. Now, if you had the know-how, if you were someone like a Cheech, you would then be able to delegate and then have the know-how to be a good manager and then deal with this pending pile of things to do. So then there's also physiologic stress. Physiologic stress results from the inability of the physiology to maintain balance, a steady state, and or homeostasis. So that is really important because when we talk about physiologic stress, we're not talking about conscious stress that we think, oh my God, I have too much to do, not enough time. Or, oh my God, I got a bill from the IRS and I don't have enough money to pay. Stuff like that. We're talking about this unconscious inability to maintain steadiness, such as eating a pepperoni pizza at midnight with a Häagen-Dazs ice cream and a big, huge Coca-Cola, and then going to bed. That leads to indigestion and this physiologic instability, which is really not a psychological process, but a physiologic process. Hans Selye was a physiologist who came up with the term stress, and he defined stress as that which obstructs the flow of intelligence. Why? Because when individuals are stressed, if they don't have a cultured nervous system, what happens is they turn off the frontal cortex from the rest of the brain. That flight, or freeze response dissociates that which makes us human, which is the frontal cortex. This is where we reason. This is where we solve problems. So some individuals with an uncultivated nervous system, then they turn off the frontal cortex, and then really they suffer the consequences of being unable to solve the challenge. Now, for that, we look at meditation as a way of cultivating the nervous system to maintain that frontal cortex online with the rest of the brain. So there are three main meditation techniques. Here, meditation, we are in reference to a process that requires thinking to have an effect on our physiology, an effect on our outcome. So one of the common forms of meditation is concentration. In concentration, we try to control an object. We control the mind. Those are concentrative techniques, such as a Buddhist monk who sits in a particular posture and concentrates on an item or concentrates on an idea. In this form of meditation, we are controlling thought. We are going against the natural tendency of the mind to move. We're trying to control the mind. Another common form of meditation is contemplation. In contemplative practices, we observe an object. That's what we call it, contemplation. Run-of-the-mill contemplative experience is sort of brainstorming, trying to figure out how to solve a problem. When we contemplate, we're focusing or thinking to a problem, or we are focusing our breath, or we're focusing our movement, or time in space. That actually is focusing a thought, focusing to an object. We're still controlling mind. Another form of meditation is auto-transcending. In transcendental meditations, the goal is to lose the object, which is different from contemplation or concentration, when we observe or control an object. In transcendental meditation, the goal is to stop meditating spontaneously, to lose thought and just be, creating a state of restful alertness. Now, we're frequently asked to compare mindfulness with transcendental meditation, and I thought it would be a good idea to sort of go over that differentiation. In mindfulness, or MBSR, the program was developed in the 1970s at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester by Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. It is taught in an 8-week program, includes weekly 2.5-hour sessions. There is a 1-day-long weekend class, and there are 45 minutes of daily home practice exercises. Mindfulness techniques include body techniques in which we pay attention to a part of our body, or to our breath, or to our movement. The goal is to focus the mind into some physiologic process, trying to avoid any other deviation from the focus. TM is different than MBSR because it was not created in the 1970s. It is an ancient secular mental technique that arises from a tradition of yoga masters. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi did not invent or did not discover transcendental meditation. He just popularized it in the West and then back in India. He started in a 1-to-1 session that lasts 60 to 90 minutes, and then in group sessions over 3 90-minute sessions. So it's taught over 4 days. And it uses the tendency of the mind to spontaneously shift to that which is pleasant to the mind. And through a systematic refinement of thinking, in transcendental meditation, the mind settles and stays in a state of restful alertness, which was described by science in 1971. So let me give you a little graphic explaining this. In concentrative techniques, the EEG is a gamma EEG. So you have gamma waves, which are 20 to 50 megahertz waves. Now, we can think of the mind as a body of water, where we have a surface and we have a depth. In focused attention, we place our attention and we control the conscious thinking mind at the surface of this body of water. In open monitoring techniques like mindfulness and other types of meditation, contemplative techniques, we have an EEG, which is theta waves, very particular theta waves, and our goal is to observe an object. That happens also in the superficial aspect of the mind. In automatic self-transcending techniques, the EEG is not gamma, is not theta, is alpha 1, particularly in the frontal cortex, and is an 8 to 10 hertz wavelength. And its goal is to experience thought at finer and refined levels in which then there is no thought. Remember, we lose the thought and we're just in a state of thoughtless awareness or purely conscious, just pure consciousness. And that's how we differentiate the different types of meditation. They're really differentiated as a comparison of cognitive control. In the first two, we control the mind. In the last one, we just let the mind be active but undirected so that it can move to that which is pleasant to the mind. So this is actually what happens to the physiology. During the practice of transcendental meditation, the M of meds, we see here in the left a 16% drop in oxygen consumption in the orange and carbon dioxide production. In the right, we see this oxygen consumption drop as compared to sleep over a 6 to 8 hour period, where we achieve very deep rest during that 20-minute period. That is associated with an improvement in insulin resistance, as published from a paper in the Archives of Internal Medicine from UCLA. These are people with coronary artery disease who were pre-diabetic, and after 16 weeks, the meditation group had a drop in HOMA, or insulin resistance, while the health education group increased their insulin resistance. Their glucose levels with meditation drop after 16 weeks of meditation, while it actually remained unchanged or went up in the control groups. When you look at blood pressure, and this is actually a study looking at 966 subjects, this is actually meta-analysis. You can see that both systolic and diastolic blood pressure drop with the practice of transcendental meditation. Now, how does that compare with mindfulness? Mindfulness is associated in the office with a drop in the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. But they also did a continuous 24-hour study in subjects looking at their blood pressure that way. And they did not see a significant drop in the blood pressure of the subjects. That is, there was an effect on white coat syndrome, but no effect on high blood pressure outside of the doctor's office. That led to the conclusion from the American Heart Association scientific statement that TM modestly lowers the blood pressure. So TM has a class 2B recommendation to lower blood pressure, while mindfulness and other meditation techniques, yoga and relaxation techniques, were not recommended. They were class 3. They show no benefits in lowering the blood pressure. That's why at the South Asian Heart Center, we have incorporated transcendental meditation as our meditation technique of choice. And that's what we recommend to our subjects. Now, let's look at longevity. And long-term, this slide shows that long-term meditators here, people who have been practicing meditation, transcendental meditation for 8 years or more, were 12 years biologically younger than the control subjects. Meditators who have been practicing only 3 years or less were 5 years younger than their own their chronologic age. So that can explain why in subjects who have coronary artery disease, documented coronary artery disease, these are 210 subjects who were taught transcendental meditation in the green versus a control group that went to a health education class. After 5 years, there was a 47% reduction in heart attack, stroke, my goodness, and or mortality. When we look at another study that was actually published here from Oakland in African Americans, you can see in the left that the practice of transcendental meditation was associated with a significant drop in the systolic blood pressure of about 10 millimeters after 3 months of practicing TM, and 5 millimeters in the diastolic blood pressure after 3 months of practicing TM, as compared to usual care or a different technique called progressive muscular relaxation. On the right side, you see the all-cause mortality and the cardiovascular mortality. The all-cause mortality dropped by about 38% in the practitioners of TM versus the control, and a bigger effect for all, and as well as an all-cause mortality effect. This is a study that was done at Harvard looking at residents in a nursing home, individuals who were over the age of 76, and they were followed over 3 years. And they actually applied in the blue transcendental meditation. In the yellow, they actually had mindfulness. Then on the orange or pink, the relaxation, progressive muscular relaxation, or a control group. And what was seen is that after 3 years, there was 100% longevity in the TM group, and that was better than the other different techniques, as well as a lower blood pressure in the TM group and increased cognitive flexibility. I'm going to share some data with you about my experience in the San Francisco School District. So in 2007, I participated in a program called Quiet Time within the San Francisco School District, and I was the medical director for this program. So this Visitation Valley School is a school that is in South San Francisco, and in 2007 was going to be closed from No Child Left Behind. When we went there, this is the GPA in 2007. By the end of the year, the GPA with the practice of TM went up. And over the next 3 years, the GPA of the students who were practicing quiet time, that is 15 minutes of transcendental meditation at the beginning of the school day and at the end of the school day, the GPA consistently went up. The same was true for Everett Middle School. Visitation Valley School is in a tough neighborhood, and they had many fights, daily fights in the school at the beginning before we went in there. That's why one of the reasons it was a very dysfunctional school. And what happened is that by the end of the study, Visitation Valley School went from the highest suspension rate in the San Francisco School District to the lowest suspension rate in the San Francisco School District. In 2007, children had to go through a metal detector to go to school. By 2010, there was no metal detector. In 2007, there was a full-time policeman on campus. By 2010, there was no policeman on campus. And the effects were very impressive. So this is just a summary slide on the practice of transcendental meditation. I have it here because you'll be able to review this on PDF format and also online. Now let's move to exercise. And when we talk about exercise, we're not only talking about physical activity, but we're talking about fitness. Fitness is the capacity to do, and you need to be both mentally and physically fit to be able to do. So this is actually, this slide sort of is a 20-year study, a study that was done in Japan, looking at fitness. So at the beginning, they did an exercise stress test, and they separated individuals into 4 groups. People who were able to exercise over 10 metabolic units, which is a measurement of fitness, and individuals who were incapable of exercising less than 5 metabolic units. As you can see here, the individuals who were fit at the beginning of the study over 20 years, 80% of them were alive, as compared to only 40% of them in the people who were unfit. Very similar to what I showed you at the beginning of the presentation from the health trial in individuals who were 70 years of age and were followed for 10 years. So fitness is really important. Now, the first experiments, the first science that was done on the effects of physical activity on longevity and cardiovascular disease were done at work. And this is actually the first publication that was published in 1953 in Lancet. And they looked at 2 workers, the driver and the conductor of a 2-decker bus in London. And they look at the incidence of heart attack and survival after a heart attack. So you can see that the drivers had a higher incidence of heart attack than the conductors. The conductors, they don't conduct a symphony. The conductor is someone who goes around up and down picking up the tickets to drive in the bus, selling the fare to drive on, to be taken in the bus. Those who had heart attacks, the survival of the active conductor versus a sitting down driver was significantly improved. The mortality rate was half that in the conductors that in the drivers. That was the first study showing the health benefits of physical activity. This is another study, but this study again was done in Oakland, in the port in the longshoremen in Oakland. And longshoremen in those days, there were people who were physically active, who were really unloading the ships without machines, and there were also the managers who were walking around with a clipboard. You can see that the high physical activity longshoremen had significant lower cardiovascular mortality versus those who had more sedentary jobs at the port. And the sudden death was actually much less in the high workload individuals versus the lower workup individuals. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, let's look at a prospective trial. These were individuals who were studied at the Cooper Clinic, 10,000 men and 3,000 women, and they were followed over 8 years. So they did an exercise stress test on the woman and the men and separate them as low workload capacity or high workload capacity, low fitness and high fitness. As you can see, that the high fitness woman had fewer deaths per 10,000 years than the low fitness woman, and the same was true for men. Now, the next question becomes, well, what happens if you are low fitness and then you improve your fitness? And this is what is shown in this study, again from the Cooper Clinic. This is what happens to people 5 years later. They did an exercise stress test and then a repeat exercise stress test. And this is 5 years later. And this is actually what happens. People who were unfit at both exercise stress tests had the highest mortality rate. Those who were unfit and improved their level of fitness cut their mortality rate by half. And those who were actually fit at both exercise stress tests had about a 65% lower mortality rate than those who were unfit on both stress tests. So this is very impressive, just showing how fitness is so key to successful aging and surviving. So from this data, if you, for every 1 minute that you increase on a Bruce protocol exercise stress test, you enhance your longevity by 8%. If you increase your capacity to exercise 1 metabolic equivalent, you actually lower your mortality benefit. You gain this mortality benefit by 20%. That is, if you exercise 7 metabolic units and then you exercise to 8 metabolic units, you have a boost of 20% in longevity. So that's very significant. And most medicines cannot do that. Now, then the next question is, what happens if you are overweight or obese? So you can see here that those who are fit, they do best even if they are overweight. They do better than those who are unfit and lean. So fitness is really more important than body mass index. Body mass index being a very important determinant of health. So if you cannot lose weight, or if you are somewhat of the larger size, then and you are not able to lose that weight, pay attention to being fit. Now, this is actually a very interesting slide because it takes a look at how we degenerate with time. So as we get older, unfortunately, our capacity will diminish. And, our pulmonary elasticity will diminish. Or aorta elasticity will diminish. But you can see what happens. 30 metabolic units, it defines someone who is very fit. So if you are a high intensity runner and you maintain that, you're a high intensity runner at the age of 30, and you maintain that to the age of 70, you will be way ahead of 30 metabolic units. If you are a high intensity runner, but you continue running at a reduced intensity, you're way ahead of even dropping from 13 or even 10 metabolic units. But if you stop training, you can see that you quickly start deteriorating. 10 metabolic units, you can take care of yourself. 7 metabolic units here, you start having problems of taking care of yourself. So if you are untrained at the age of 20 and you don't train and you just sit around and just do your living, your regular daily life, hoping to stay healthy, as you actually decrease your capacity with time, by the time that you make it to 70, you'll be close to the 10 metabolic unit, below the 10 metabolic unit. And you will then be at risk for losing your self-sufficiency, your capacity to do on your own. Now, now we're going to talk about mental capacity. This is actually what happens to students. This is actually the fitness zones of high school students. In students who are in the highest fitness category tend to have the best outcome in math and language examination outcomes. So the fit individuals' physical fitness is associated with increased aptitude and increased mental capacity, both in math and language, as well as the fitter they are, the less the absenteeism. So having children pay attention to their fitness pays off with better academic achievement. Now, let's say that even though we feel like we're kids now getting vaccinated, every month, if you look at a 65-year-old individual and our concern at the age of 65 is cognitive decline, I'm showing you a study that was done in New York looking at individuals at the age of 65 separated by those who were physically active 3 times a week versus those who were not physically active or less than 3 times a week. You can see that with time, there is a 38% drop in the risk of dementia in those who are physically active 3 or more times per week. In fact, aerobic exercise is the most potent activity to prevent dementia. It's not solving puzzles or reading novels or getting PhDs. So now let's talk a little bit about interaction. So if we're physically active, this slide shows that if we're physically active, but spend 180 minutes of sedentary activity per day, like watching a television or watching a computer screen, we cut the benefit of exercise by more than half. So that's what this shows, that if you don't watch much television or the computer screen and you don't exercise, and you exercise, this is the mortality, the relative risk ratio of having cardiovascular events. These are the people who actually are not physically active and who also spend more than 180 minutes in front of a screen. You can see that if they're physically active, they become physically active, they have a significant drop in cardiovascular events. Unfortunately, the typical American spends significant amount of time in front of a computer screen. If you're not able to meet the criteria for physical activity, then get yourself a dog, because dog owners, 47% of dog owners tend to meet the criteria of exercise just by owning a dog, by taking the dog for a walk. So here, there's some exercise facts in case you want to sort of fact check me, which I think is important in this day and age. Now we're talking about nutrition as we're moving right along. And I just show this slide because we're definitely, and you have seen this before, we are surrounded by weapons of mass expansion. And about 6 out of 10 Americans are overweight or obese. And this is a significant issue. This is a slide that shows the effect of body mass index on coronary artery disease, as you can see here. There's a linear relationship between the body mass index and coronary artery disease. And that's what we found in that paper that Ashish mentioned at the beginning of the conference. After age, body mass index is the most important factor for coronary calcification. Ischemic stroke also shows a linear relationship with body mass index. So it is important to pay attention to our weight. This is what Ashish was referring to. This is actually the relative influence of risk factors for the severity of coronary arteriosclerosis. Age being the most important, meaning the older you are, the more coronary arteriosclerosis you have, followed by body mass index and abnormalities in lipid metabolism, smoking, fasting blood sugar, and diastolic blood pressure. So you can see that at least in South Asians, 3 of the factors that drive arteriosclerosis are associated with diabetes. That is fasting blood sugar, body mass index, and the non-HDL cholesterol to ApoB ratio. Let's now talk a little bit about the diner versus the dinner. Most of the time, we pay attention to what is in front of us on the plate, and we tend to forget about the diner, the person who is sitting in front of the plate. But we need to take that into consideration. In Ayurveda, we know the body type, also the metabolic fire of the individual, that in Ayurveda is called Agni. Genetically, individuals who have different isotypes of the ApoE isoform will digest their fat and carbohydrates differently, and that will have an effect on your laboratory lab work. The presence of breakfast and the number of meals makes a big difference. Skipping breakfast is associated with a fourfold higher incidence of obesity. Having less than 3 meals a day is associated with the same. So this is what I just showed, that if you have 4 or more meals per day, you have a 45% lower risk of obesity. If you skip breakfast, you have a 4.5 increased risk of obesity. If you tend to eat out most of your meals, you tend to have more obesity and such. If you have a plant-rich diet, you tend to have a lower LDL cholesterol. If you have significant 3 or more servings of fruits and vegetables, you tend to see a 25% or 24% lower incidence of ischemic heart disease, a 27% lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, which includes stroke and hypertension, and a 27% lower incidence of stroke, just by having fruits and vegetables in your diet. This is one of my favorite slides, looking at fruit as compared to fruit juices. This one here is what happens when you have a cup and a half or 3 servings of blueberries per week. You tend to have a 26% lower incidence of diabetes as compared to having fruit juice if you have a cup and a half of blueberries per week. And how the other, in fact, most people think, oh my God, grapes and raisins are very sweet, but you actually have a 12% lower incidence of diabetes if you eat some raisins and fruit per week. If you have juice, you have about an 8% increased risk of diabetes. There is no effect from the stone fruits, but even a banana lowers your incidence by 5%. Higher fiber in the diet is associated with significant drop in diabetes. That is, if you change white rice to brown rice, you decrease your risk of diabetes by 17%. If you change it from rice to a different grain, such as millet, you decrease your risk of diabetes by 36%. Highest fiber intake versus lowest fiber intake, there's a 60% difference in diabetes between higher fiber intake and lower fiber intake. Why? Because the enzyme that digests glycogen and slows that is in the fiber, is in the hulk of the grain. So what happens when we refine grain, we eliminate that fiber. This is just more data. There's a lot of data here and we don't have time, but I just want to point to your attention one thing, because we have these lectures, diet just a one lecture, exercise one lecture. If you have pre-diabetes and you add 2 tablespoons of olive oil to your regular diet daily, you decrease the incidence of diabetes by 40%. And this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine as part of the PeriMate trial. So that's really, and it tastes good. Fish oil in the diet without, we're talking about a supplement, decreases your triglycerides and increases your HDL cholesterol. the amount of omega-3s in red blood cells is associated, at least in a doctor study, with a 90% reduction in sudden cardiac death. One serving of dark, oily fish, like you see in salmon, per week is associated with a drop in macular degeneration, which is the most common cause of blindness in the USA, by 48%. So this is just food in, the health benefits of food. Having a soft drink per week, having a soft drink per day as compared to less than one per month, it increases your risk of diabetes almost twofold, as you can see here. And the interesting thing, it doesn't matter if it's regular soda that is sweetened or if it is actually diet soda. So we advise against drinking or calories, except maybe in milk, normal fat milk, okay? So now let's just go and move on to sleep. And we're almost coming to the end. But, sleep is actually a very dynamic process. We recreate ourselves when we sleep. At the end of the day, we're tired. We put our heads down. Spontaneously, the mind knows without any effort to fall asleep. In fact, if we put effort, it doesn't work. And then as we rest, the physiology, by its natural tendency, recreates itself. And that has an effect on the immune system. It has an effect on our muscular strength and our metabolism. Now, I'm just going to show you a quick video because I think it's fascinating. This is from The Economist, and it describes sleep, the physiology of sleep.
Almost everyone on the planet enters into a state of unconsciousness and paralysis. But what is really happening inside the body when we drift off? And what's the impact if we don't get enough sleep? Sleep is regulated by your circadian rhythm, or body clock, located in the brain. The body clock responds to light cues, ramping up production of the hormone melatonin at night and switching it off when it senses light. There are 4 stages of sleep that the body experiences in cycles throughout the night. On a good night, we cycle through these stages 4 or 5 times. Stages 1 and 2 are light sleep. This is the transition from being awake to falling asleep. Heart rate and breathing begin to slow, body temperature falls, and muscles may twitch. Stage 3 is sometimes referred to as delta sleep because of the slow delta brainwaves that are released during this stage. This is the first stage of deep sleep, where our cells produce the most growth hormone to service bones and muscles, allowing the body to repair itself. Stage 4 is where we begin to dream. The body creates chemicals that render it temporarily paralyzed, so that we do not act out our dreams. In this stage, the brain is extremely active, and our eyes, although closed, dart back and forth as if we were awake. Humans roughly spend 1/3 of their lives asleep. Modern lifestyles, stress, and the proliferation of technology mean that people are sleeping far less today than they were a century ago. Sleeping less than 7 hours per day is associated with an increased risk of developing chronic conditions, which could reduce life expectancy. So for a healthier, longer life, get some shut-eye.
So this is actually what she was referring to. In 1910, the typical American slept 9 hours. In 1975, we had color television and Johnny Carson. And in 2005, I guess we got the iPhone. Associated with that, there's less sleep. Associated with that, a typical body weight of the typical American in 1910 was 23, the BMI. In 1975, 25, and in 2005, 27, making the typical American overweight. This is actually a slide that shows a sweet spot of the 7 to 8 hours. At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the Alameda 7, where the first factor was sleeping 7 to 8 hours. And that has been confirmed in multiple studies. As you can see, this is outcome from the Whitehall trial. Between sleeping 7 to 8 hours tend to have the least hazard. People who sleep more than 9 hours tend to have higher incidence of diabetes and cancer. People who sleep less than 5 hours or less tend to have a higher incidence of hypertension and coronary artery disease. And this is very true and has been repeated consistently. Now, we talked about the hours of sleep. There's another interesting factor that was recently published this year in January, that is not only the duration of sleep, but the regular sleep routine. Being able to go to bed at the same time and sleeping through the night, rather than the total amount of sleep. As you can see, someone who has a regular routine of uninterrupted sleep has the best survival as versus someone who has a very irregular sleep routine. Then the next question is, well, how about if you sleep during the weekend? Unfortunately, if you are waking up in the morning with an alarm clock, you are not getting enough sleep. But most people do not turn their alarm clock in the weekend. So they actually, if they are able to catch up with some of the sleep on the weekend, they have a significant 18%, 28% lower incidence of angina, a significant 32% lower incidence of stroke, and a significant 27% lower incidence of coronary artery disease. Just being able to catch up in the morning during the weekends with an alarm. So let me just sort of summarize. We know that 81% of heart attacks can be preventable. I show you the PROCOM trial and the ARIC trial. 93% of diabetes is preventable if you have those 4 healthy factors. So that is the basis of the curriculum at the South Asian Heart Center. And that's the basis for our MEDS platform, in which our goal is meditation, transcending twice a day for 20 minutes, exercising 150 minutes per week, 30 minutes 5 times a week, working on strength 2 times a week, and sort of varying the intensity. Also, a little stretching is of benefit. Diet, take-home message, more greens, fewer grains. Having a green-based diet rather than a white-based diet. Having 2 fists of vegetables per day, 1 fist of fruit per day, and 12 nuts daily. And lastly, sleeping 7 to 8 hours, waking up with an alarm clock. If you want to obtain any help in incorporating these healthy factors into your life routine, then please, you can actually reach the South Asian Heart Center by contacting us using and signing up for a lifestyle consultation. The goal is to burn clean. The goal is to actually have a nice, clean metabolism by paying attention not only to the plate, but to the diner. And we do that by sleeping 7 to 8 hours, meditating regularly, and being physically active. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Molina. Can I start asking questions that people have already posted?
Correct. Let's go for it.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience, by the way.
I see eating breakfast daily on the Alameda 7. How do you reconcile that with the benefits of intermittent fasting?
So intermittent fasting doesn't mean that you skip breakfast. It means you skip dinner. But intermittent fasting is really another way of talking about intermittent fasting is time restricted eating. And this time restricted eating, it usually involves eating only for 8 hours a day. So then the question is, where do you gain the most benefit, eating at night or eating during the day? And that has been studied. If you have a similar caloric content diet in individuals who are on a weight loss program and they have most of those calories before 3 p.m., that group will lose more weight than those who consume most of their calories after 3 p.m. So I think just because our lifestyle, we had that typical American lifestyle, we have dinner as our biggest meal, but actually having the biggest meal at the end of the day is not associated with the best metabolic health. In fact, exercising before meals and after meals, which doesn't happen when you're having meals in the evening, tend to be associated with the best metabolic outcome.
Okay, thank you. Question from Kuldeep Singh. If we work out at night and eat after workout, is it okay around 11 p.m.?
So can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, it's talking about eating after workout, late night, around 11 p.m.
Okay.
Asking if it's
So
okay.
I think that what I just mentioned,
Yes.
what I just mentioned holds true. And that is that if going to bed with a full stomach is not ideal. It's associated with reflux, which is associated with asthma. It's associated with esophageal changes in the esophageal mucosa, something called Barrett's esophagus, which is a pre-malignant condition that can lead to esophageal cancer. So the question here, I would just turn it around, and then is when is it best to exercise? If you're doing muscle building exercises, you get most of the muscle build, you get a better boost of muscle building if you exercise at the end of the day. If you want to achieve aerobic benefit and metabolic benefit from aerobic exercise, you get most of the benefit by exercising 8 hours before your largest higher fat diet, which is in the evening, that is exercising in the morning.
Okay. Next question is on TM. Do we have a TM group at South Asian Art Center, and are there any coaches for TM?
So we actually have a weekly introductory informational meeting for members of the South Asian Heart Center community at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesdays. And I give that presentation on Zoom. And people register online. And then they have an opportunity after going through this informational meeting. In this informational meeting, we talk about what TM is and is not, how it works, what are the principles behind it, and where does it come from. And then people can decide. Someone has actually given a grant. So until November 12th, the cost of the tuition of learning transcendental meditation has been cut by half. And the tuition is dependent on your income and can be paid over a period of time by putting it on your credit card, and the credit card is charged over a period of time depending, is on the honor system. What this tuition entails is not only learning the technique, but having a lifetime of follow-up throughout the world.
Okay, that sounds like a great deal, Dr. Molina.
It is a great deal.
Next question is, I understand that South Asians have different genetics that lead to different CVD diabetes prevalence. Much of the data based on which recommendations are made to South Asians are from cohorts that are not South Asian. Can we trust that data from other ethnicities, which reflect benefits that we will, sorry, can we trust that data for South Asians too, when there are
So that's a very
genetics
good
that is
question.
different?
That is actually a very good question. But, and the reason that that question is a good question is that when we apply most of the formulas to predict heart disease that have been generated among non-South Asians, we fail to capture the increased risk. However, there was a recent paper published in Circulation looking at the United Kingdom's database, which is a huge database, and looking at Quick Risk 3 that includes a modification for South Asians. And even then, that formula does not capture the increased risk. There is no question, though, that we have shown you from that slide that I showed you, study done on 1,100 South Asians, what are the factors associated with severity of coronary calcification by heart scan? Age being number one, BMI being number two, non-HDL to ApoB cholesterol being number three and very similar to BMI. That means the concentration of cholesterol per particle of non-HDL cholesterol, fasting blood sugar, diastolic blood pressure. South Asians having a higher diastolic blood pressure than the general population. So the data that we have available has been generated in South Asians. Now, what I show you from the ARIC trial was not generated in South Asians, showing that you can change outcomes in midlife. But our data that we have generated internally is that if you get yourself into our MEDS program, we see that people lose weight, they have a drop in hemoglobin A1C, they have a drop in blood pressure, and they have better outcomes.
Thank you. Next question is on dementia and the meditation technique. It says our senior population with dementia is increasing. Is there any technique like TM or mindfulness that can be helpful for them?
Okay, so that's actually a very good question. It's frequently asked. So the issue about dementia is a continuum. So in early dementia, at UCLA, they're doing a study showing that the preliminary study showing that the practice of TM significantly modulates the progression of that dementia and improves cognitive capacity. There's a lot of data that has not been generated necessarily in South Asians, but in general populations that look at our MEDS platform and dementia, particularly aerobic exercise, as I just showed you, school performance in children, and also the use of the Mediterranean diet as a way of prevention of dementia. Diabetes is associated with increased risk of dementia. Hypertension is associated with increased incidence of dementia. So if you live well, and if you do things that are associated with decreased high blood pressure and decreased diabetes, you would expect to have improvement in cognitive capacity. I have not seen any study or prospective study or any studies looking at any form of meditation in the treatment of dementia. As a TM teacher, I have taught individuals with mild dementia, and they have been able to practice TM.
Someone is asking what is 1 metabolic unit means.
A metabolic unit is a way of stating the amount of oxygen consumption that an individual is experiencing with exercise. When we sit and do nothing, we actually are burning about 3 metabolic units. That's the amount or oxygen consumption at baseline. We should be able to increase that fivefold to 50 metabolic units. Now, that is actually what a test pilot did in the 1950s when the Bruce Protocol exercise stress test did. And that's considered to be the height of human fitness in America in the 1950s. If you want to switch that by metabolic unit to VO2 movement, that would be multiplied 3.5 by that one metabolic unit, and I'll give you oxygen delivery or VO2 max. Next.
Is it associated with burning the calories? Like somebody has responded, burn 1,000 calories. Is that true?
So actually, to burn calories, you actually have to use oxygen. So if you are actually have exercising at a high level of a hard workload, then you're burning more metabolic units. Now, this is really important because this goes back to physics that we studied in high school. Work is measured in distance. So running 1,000 meters and walking 1,000 meters burns the same burns the same amount of calories because it's the same amount of joules, that's how you determine work. Now, the issue is that if you run 1,000 meters, you have more time later on to burn more calories than if you walk it.
Okay. Next question is about toddlers and kids, where sometimes doctors are advising them to increase caloric intake, carbs, fats, etc., to help with the weight gain. However, are there any long-term CVD or diabetes risk at an older age that emerges from this sort of eating at a younger age in kids?
Well, you're referring to, that's a question that is sort of interesting. And that is, there are times when children are born underweight. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there's a drive to increase the caloric intake. You also have to be a little careful because the regular newborn loses about 5 to 7% of their weight within the first 10 days because they have a prompt, they're puffy as they're born, and they have a significant diuretic effect. And there is this unanswered question, and that is, do you need to overfeed them and do tertiary feedings to counteract that, or is that normal physiology? I feel that, in my opinion, and I am not a pediatrician, my opinion that is normal physiology and that kids make it up. And I can show you I can show you my nephew, but sometimes they push for that. Obese or overweight children tend to be obese and overweight adults, and there are significant consequences to obesity in adulthood, such as increased cancer, increased diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and everything bad that can happen to a human in the industrialized world is associated with BMI.
Okay. Next question is, Parthasarthi is, amazed to hear that in one of your today's presentation, you mentioned that yoga and pranayama has no effect on BP.
So this is not what I mentioned. The American Heart Association, a comprehensive evaluation of all those techniques did not demonstrate a consistent drop in blood pressure with the use of yoga or other relaxation techniques, or MBSR. Therefore, they put it under category 3, which is not recommended. Now, that is what the American Heart Association has evaluated. Could there be individuals who benefit from pranayama? Yes, I think there are. And I think that recommendation did not include pranayama. They said yoga and other MBSR and other relaxation techniques. But I don't think that because the studies on pranayama, I'm not sure that there are too many studies on pranayama and hypertension where they could analyze it. I'm sure that if someone were to study it consistently, they will see some great health benefits from doing pranayama.
Okay. Does it matter what kind of fiber we consume?
Well, you know, there are two types. There's soluble and insoluble fiber. You need both. And so I think that clearly to have, you see, there are artificial bulking agents that are sold, like, and then there are just natural. I prefer for people, and I prefer for myself to have real, regular food. So that is my preference, and that's what the data shows. So if you're going to add fiber to your diet or have brown rice and have tons of broccoli, cauliflower, eggplant, oats, I prefer all that versus artificial food or processed food.
Okay, next question is for Ashish actually. Person wants to know if they can get slides. I know we give
I
recording.
actually posted the link to the slides already.
Oh, okay.
And
Thank
I
you,
asked
Ashish.
people to see if they could open it. And one person responded that they could open it. Another person responded that they could not. And so I've asked people who want the slides to send me an email at sahc@elcaminohealth.org.
Oh, one thing
Okay.
about all the slides is that they are all referenced. So you should actually, there's nothing like going to the going to the reference and doing the kind of study. As you study it, it really hits you and stays in you.
Dr. Batina is saying thank you for the, very simple and yet massive data of knowledge presentation. The next question is on, in regards to exercise, have a family member who has severe back pain and difficulty walking and standing. How can she increase her aerobic activity?
So that's actually a very good question, because most of the time when we're thinking about aerobic exercise, we're thinking about walking, running. But you can also, if you have orthopedic issues that prevent you from doing that, you can swim. You can also, if you're lucky, if you have Medicare, there are many gyms will give you free membership to Medicare, to Medicare recipients, and you can use a rowing machine in which you're sitting very comfortably, doing aerobic exercise that way. You can actually get up and get down from a chair, sit up and sit down, stuff like that. And just, just gentle, you do whatever you can. Now, the problem is that you hurt more if you don't move. And you can experiment with that. Most of the time, when you wake up in the morning, then usually inflammatory processes tend to be more there's more heat there. Once you start moving the joints, then as the joints warm up, there's less discomfort. Anything
Anita,
else?
can we have one last question, Anita?
Oh, okay. I haven't even reached to the bottom. So, there was question regarding the redoing the coronary calcification test after 5 years.
Okay.
Is that the recommendation?
So it depends. So the coronary calcium score is the best test to determine future risk for cardiac events. If you had a coronary calcium score of 0 at the age of 65, I don't think that you need to check again. You need to get yourself a doctor who's not a cardiologist for a specialist, because you probably will have problems in other fields rather than in the cardiac field. Now, if you actually, at a younger age, if you have a coronary calcium score, for example, if you're in your 40s and you have any coronary calcification, you have significant arteriosclerosis already, you don't need to have repeated coronary calcium scans. So only if there is a concern that the initial scan is not appropriate to go and project over 5 years. Most of the studies are projected only to 5 years. But if you are low risk and you have a score of 0, you can extend that to 10. If you have a score of 0, and in the meantime you develop diabetes, is inconsequential. You need to be on statins, independent of your Coulson score. However, if you're taking statins and you have diabetes and you have multiple side effects to the statins, you can get a coronary calcium score, and if it's 0, then you don't need to really work hard at taking the statin. You can actually stop them because of the side effects.
Okay.
So the answer is not straightforward.
Yes. I'll ask the last question. Are there any cross studies of TM, exercise, and sleep?
Are there studies incorporating those three things together and see the
Yes.
relationship between them?
Yeah.
I have not seen any.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Molina.
You're welcome. Thanks. It's been a long time since I, chatted with you, and this is actually very rewarding to be able to sort of go and revisit the origin of the MEDS platform for the South Asian Heart Center, and to actually demonstrate that it's really truly science-based. And the most beautiful thing is that Ashish mentioned at the beginning, this is a science-based Vedic approach to health.
Thank you, Dr.
So,
Molina. That was
excellent.
very, very enlightening. I think we are getting comments from everybody about how rich your presentation has been. Very, very deep as well. Thank you. You thoroughly researched all of those hard, scientific evidence and presented very simply and beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next one. Bye-bye.